So we will be moving to the next topic, which I think transitions from the last, the previous question around social issues. This one will be focusing on the S in ESG, and the next panelist is Bonnie-Lyn Bartok. She's founder and CEO of the S Factor company. She brings over 2 decades of social impact measurement and management, international business, finance, and technology experience. So glad to have you here today, Bonnie. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Bonnie.
Yeah, great segment, great segue into this topic. There was lots of questions about social I saw popping up. So this session is really for those of you who are interested in responsible investments, which consider human rights as well as carbon reduction. So it is the S and ESG conversation. The social factors in ESG, which complement environmental and governance factors, are ultimately about the prevention of harm. So there's been a couple of major events in the last 2 weeks alone, which signal the emphasis and priority being placed on these issues that investors should strongly consider in contrast or in comparison or even in contention with carbon issues, and how disruptive this will be to asset managers and portfolios in the weeks and months to come. So number one is modern slavery regulations being enforced. So EU, Canada, US, even Australia, new laws targeting human rights abusers with sanctions, calling for strengthening of modern slavery acts to follow. So if we think about the most recent event, US embargoed Top Glove for assumed forced labor practices at the border. So no longer allowing products into the country who have known forced labor practices behind the scenes in the supply chain. This is a big deal. Other signals of events prioritizing social issues. The EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulator or framework has called for a reclassification of funds, and specifically related to Articles 8 and 9 of this framework. In very simple terms, what it's doing, it's a lot more complicated than this, but in very simple terms, what it's doing is separating out the classification of funds that are focused on impact targets versus ESG regulation. So codes and conventions, regulations on modern slavery versus targeting something like healthcare accessibility, financial literacy, reduction of disease or incident of a particular topic. 2 very different things. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because it's critical to the social conversation and where we're going and what's trending. Most recently, and probably the most significant event, is SEC fires a warning shot, the article says, about the associated risks with ESG classified products and services. So when you read this release, SEC very clearly announces that they are not comfortable or they're not going to contribute to regulating ESG, standardizing ESG, scoring ESG against products and services. What they are going to do, and the reason is because there are too many varieties of the interpretation of ESG. And so what they are going to do, though, is they're going to investigate products to ensure that they are doing what they say they do. So if they are focused on investing in carbon reducing products, but there is no accountability for social governance issues of labor force and supply chain, then it's a carbon product. It's not an ESG product. The other emphasis that they placed is that companies and investors will be held to account for what they say they're doing. If they are reliant on third-party providers, alternative providers of data, they will ultimately be responsible for the due diligence of how that third-party data came about the information. Where are they sourcing the content? Is it legitimate? Is it material? Is it legally sourced? And so we get into the ethics conversation, which I'll touch on in a bit. But I want to cover 4 key areas for investors to consider about S and ESG. It's everything that you need to know about where we are right now And if you're, to consider including human rights considerations in your screens. And if you're already down that road, but you're experiencing chaos, hopefully this will help you to navigate it by focusing on these 4 key areas. So the first area is criteria. What is the criteria for social, or S in ESG? So I want to come back to the association of ESG, environmental social governance issues, versus the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. 2 very different things. And they are often interchanged and considered mutually exclusive, which they are not. ESG criteria, or social criteria, is diagnostic. It's a collection of information that informs baseline on compliance of social regulatory issues like modern slavery, like forced labor, like child labor, like transparency in your supply chain. Sustainable development goals are prescriptive. They are impact targets. They are mission-based investing to reduce the incidence of X, Y, and Z. They largely are responsible for measuring the reduction or closing the gap of a particular, so financial literacy in a particular jurisdiction. If there is an investment vehicle that is targeting this, you want to measure what was there before you, what was there as a result, what the inputs are, and measuring and monitoring of, increased financial literacy over a period of time. So the full cycle of impact needs to be there in that accountability, baseline, input, output, impacts. Most SDG self-acclaimed products don't do this. They talk about how much money they're spending on a particular topic, but they do not follow the money, and they can't track the full impact cycle of the mission-based target. So that will be hot topic in years to come as well. So an example, if you want to invest in a company who is doing good for their community, so they're donating to schools and hospitals, they're building hockey arenas, they're keeping the peace, their social license, but they are not living up to international labor standards within their labor force. They're not discussing things like health and safety incidents, or multiple class action suits against them for racism long before the BLM movement. And I'm thinking of a particular company as I'm describing this. They don't disclose a fatality at one of their sites in the US, post hundreds of emergency service vehicle visits to that site, which would suggest that this was something predictive and preventable. If they are doing these things, they're not an ESG investment, even if they make a carbon reducing product. So these are how to separate out the issues. They're philanthropic type donations are really fit in the SDG basket, but their ESG regulations on health and safety, labor, forced labor, incident tracking, all of that are really about regulation compliance and where they are. So there are over 1,200 indicators, social risk indicators, which accompany the internal controls of a company. These performance in these areas can give investors signals as to the probabilities and risk mitigating activity on social management and controls of companies' operations at every location of operation and throughout their supply chain. This is what we monitor. There's also 1,700 external social risk factors to consider inherent in most operating environments. That's a lot, 1,200, 1,700, where do you start? So what's on trend for 2021? Very clearly diversity and inclusion beyond gender. So this is beyond the number of women on your board. This will be considerations such as anti-discrimination, freedom of association, collective bargaining, grievance management, ratios of diversity within your labor force, but also representation of equity and parity as well. So we want to see this resonating throughout the organization at the operational level through into management and ownership of the company and its decisions. Something that is reflective of the community in which the companies operate. So if you invest in a company and operates in a culture or a country that does not support diversity and inclusion, participation in the workforce based on class or gender, you will not be able to meet these goals. And this is where the inherent external environment or operating environment social risks become critical to consider as a discounted factor, especially when you're comparing assets. We're tying ESG issues to executive performance, to executive comp and pay, but they may not be able to do this if their company operates in certain jurisdictions. And by enforcing the issues, you may actually be putting people at risk. So you need to understand the inherent operating environments as well as what's being expected of you. So that's what's on trend, but what's coming next? So if we see from the recent modern slavery enforcements and the embargoes, definitely modern slavery regulations. Companies and investors will be held to account for labor regulations, forced labor, child labor, entire supply chain transparency. Think about Boohoo or Boho and Top Glove. Well, what about Amazon and Walmart? What about their entire supply chains? Where do they come from? Are we only going after foreign brands, or are we going to start to open Pandora's box here? You know, Nestle does not intend to employ child labor in their supply chain, but unless they follow those farmers every single day and monitor the conditions, you will never actually know from a supplier's report whether that's taking place or not, unless it's exposed via a controversy. Same thing with Apple, tens of thousands of intermediaries. They would never be able to ascertain where the raw materials are coming from that are in their products. Toll mining, I've been involved in toll mining assessments. That's when the price of a commodity is so low that a foreign operator can't actually afford to put into place a full operation. So they're buying from artisanal miners or illegal miners. And you will never know the conditions to which those raw materials were sourced unless you follow that truck home and monitor it. So this is a huge undertaking in terms of transparency. We have a long way to go, but which brings me to data. So where can we get the information that we need to close these gaps? So investors are currently reliant on company supplied information, rating agencies that rate the company supplied information, and enter alternative sources of content. We have some quantitative based ESG products, still predominantly focused on environmental, not really inclusive of the social just yet, but you know, we're having the conversation. These are models that are using old data sets, regurgitated content, and they're spinning up thousands of insights or analytics to try and determine leaders and laggards using variables of thematics under the totality of it. But the problem is that they're old and regurgitated. So the content that is there is still not covering all the things I just talked about. Right? So quantitative models are using old data sets, spinning up quant models seeking alpha. Then we have media-based products. So this is the biggest trend in technology now, where we're tagging keywords, we're scraping media articles, we're following links to source content, but we're tagging thematic concepts. We are not, it's highly immaterial. It's based on volume and frequency and tonality of content, but not measuring materiality, legitimacy of content in association with regulations that are required for ESG considerations. So it's you know, a step in the right direction, but certainly not foolproof. And then we have product life cycle researchers who are putting out information on how things are made. But if the totality of the operations and the labor conditions and the suppliers of the raw materials for that product are not in consideration, then again, you're not getting the 360 picture of the totality of social impact. And so then where does S factor come in? We're doing a little bit of all of these things. I guess what we have that the others don't is a standardization of social criteria across every international framework, codes, conventions, regulations, you know, 1,200 indices, and the criteria of which is standardized across all of these frameworks, from academics, from, you know, you name it, from soft law, hard law, modern slavery acts, what have you. And so our information is coming from unstructured sources and structured in accordance to those rules, both company supplied, media-based, external scraping of class action, bits and pieces of information inside class action lawsuits or government filings, you know, permits being revoked for incident, et cetera. And then we want to talk about technology. And I think Andrea did an amazing job. So I'm going to kind of echo some of the things that she talked about. Technology, what's happening in the tech front. So we know that what the criteria is for social. We know what the data sources are. We also understand what the huge social data gap that we have, especially looking at historical performance and where we're going. So what's technology doing to solve this? The demand is huge. The demand is now. So we're stuffing the hole, the social hole, with SDG information or head count of women on boards, or and we're just stuffing that hole with anything that we can tag that's related, that's relatable, and that and there's some challenges that come with that, which I'll talk about in my final point. But we're talking about ethics in AI. How is the information being sourced? If a company is not disclosing the ethnicity of their labor force population or any pay equity and parity information, where are third-party vendors getting this content? And to the point of sex investigation, investors, institutional investors, will actually be responsible for the diligence on their sourcing of content to inform their investment decisions. So if a third party is providing this content and the company's not disclosing it, how are they getting it? Right? So are you going over the boundaries of the Privacy Acts, GDPR, PII, FICID? How are you scraping? Are you doing deep web digging? Are you going into unclassified information? How are you getting the content? Because investors will ultimately be accountable for this. Previously, alternative vendors were not allowed into mainstream sources of investment decisions. Finally, in the last 5 or 6 years, we have been allowed to, but now those boundaries are starting to go up in terms of how we're sourcing that content. So ethics is a big issue. Another issue to consider in technology is algorithmic bias. So if we think about who writes the code, and I think Andrea touched on a lot of these pieces as well, who's writing the code? It's adult males, right? And it's being interpreted in the English language. So tonality, transferability of cultural associations, and also the voice of the most vulnerable are not a part of that conversation. So if we can tag, we're tagging something like 1.3 million ESG data points a day on social factors, but we are not getting the voices of the people who are the most vulnerable in the supply chains that we're about to explore. They're not online. They're not speaking in English. And the tonality of their parity and equity is not there. So we're getting a lot of data points, but it may not be the most relevant and the most material or legitimate against the regulations. So we have to consider ethics, we have to consider bias, we have to consider materiality. In technology, there's also security and integrity. So most vendors will not be able to supply institutional investors unless they're using certain types of technology for transference of data, API accessibility and what have you. So there's a lot of intermediaries popping up who are taking raw data and pushing it through their own APIs and consolidating that content for institutional investors as a band-aid solution in the short term. But the buy side will tell you, if you don't have your own API in a year or two, that you will not be on the consideration list. So accessibility to information, on the ethics consideration, it's being monopolized. So anyone with a decent data set that's talking about these issues is being acquired and owned, and you have to pay an exorbitant amount of money to access it. And it's informing decisions about the most vulnerable people that the data is about. So there's ethics considerations there as well. So finally, I'll just talk about SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in social, S and ESG. Strengths, what we're doing is better than nothing. We had nothing before on social content, and it's now a part of the conversation. So I think that that is a strength. We are heading in the right direction. We're doing something. Weaknesses, it's not reality for what's going on the ground. There's a gap, a large gap in expertise of this data. Opportunities, incentivizing the process. BlackRock, most of the major banks, they're all tying ESG performance to compensation and benefits. Let's just hope that this modern slavery regulations is a part of that equation on performance tied to compensation. I don't think it's there yet. I think what they mean by that is carbon performance. Threats. So finally, the great impact wash is upon us. So we look at the reclassification of funds, the difference between SDGs and ESG, SEC doing investigations on products, ESG classified products doing what they say they are doing in totality. I think there's going to be a great reset and a redistribution of allocation of assets under management in accordance to this trend as a result of this. Huge deal. So there you go. I will just say that it has been my theory since 2009 when I put out my first index that correlated social management with financial returns, that if you put the social filters first, it will actually bottleneck or curb environmental destruction. We know that environmental destruction is man-made. So if you control the social management with the signals, you will ultimately achieve greater financial returns. So I'll leave it at that and wrap it up with those lots to think about.
Yeah, thank you so much, Bonnie. That was great. I had, there are a lot of questions that have come in, great questions. And, I think, what you talked about, you hit it the nail on the head. Some of these things we need to get in order, like, the SEC risk letter and what I guess SFDR, the European regulation, is trying to do around labeling of ESG products and communication around it. It's critical we get that into place before, as all this money is pouring into this this field. All we need is an issue, with a miscommunication about something that causes a lawsuit or some sort of action that could, just like we talked about earlier with AI and, in biotech, if you get off on the wrong foot and something happens early on where it causes an issue, it could cause things to slow down a little bit. And we don't want that to happen. So I think everything you're talking about, we need to lay all that groundwork down. And it was really excellent to hear all your comments. I apologize, but we're 3 minutes over the 20, so we're going to have to move on. But I think you can answer some of the Q&A, Bonnie, in the direct Q&A if you have some time.
I will do that. Yeah, I can see some questions popping up here, so I'm happy to answer those.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much.
Peter,
if you have some closing comments, Bonnie, happy to give you a minute.
Thank you for inviting us to join this conversation. Great platform. Timing is perfect again, and so we really appreciate being a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you for your time, Bonnie. Thank you.